Roger Stone here. Your dollars are losing ground, but gold isn't. American Sovereign Bullion helps you protect your wealth through real, tangible assets. Through their nationwide wholesaler network, you get some of the best pricing on gold and silver delivered straight to your door. Since 1912, the U.S. dollar has lost 97% of its purchasing power. Meanwhile, gold continues to prove its strength. So call 844-272-2428. That's 844-272-2428. Or visit dyingdollar.com to request your free gold and silver guide. That's dyingdollar.com.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Days in the history of civilization. Let me read from the letter issued by the Supreme Allied Commander Dwight David Eisenhower on the eve of that invasion. This is addressed to the Allied Expeditionary Force, soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied force. You are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well trained, well equipped, and battle hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940 and 41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battle, man to man. Our air offense has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide, General Eisenhower wrote, has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, your devotion to duty, and your skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessings of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking. Dwight David Eisenhower. This was the day when thousands of young Americans, joined by British, Canadian, and Allied forces from many nations, stormed the beaches of Normandy and began the liberation of Europe from the grip of Adolf Hitler and National Socialism. Their courage altered the course of history. Their sacrifice preserved freedom for millions. Their victory helped save the world. Today, only a small number of men who participated in that historic operation remain with us. They belong to what journalist Tom Brokaw famously called the greatest generation. They were ordinary citizens who answered an extraordinary call. Farmers, factory workers, students, mechanics, clerks, and laborers who became soldiers, sailors, airmen, and marine. They crossed an ocean knowing that many would never return. They fought not for fame or recognition, but because they believed that freedom was worth defending. The scale of Operations Overlord remained almost impossible to comprehend. Nearly 160,000 Allied troops landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944. More than 7,000 ships and landing craft supported that invasion. More than 11,000 aircraft filled the skies. American airborne troops from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions landed behind enemy lines during the darkness before dawn. At Utah Beach and Omaha Beach, American forces assaulted heavily fortified German positions. British and Canadian forces had landed at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. By the end of the day, despite terrible casualties and fierce resistance, the Allies had established a foothold in France. The bloodiest fighting occurred in Omaha Beach, where American soldiers were met with devastating machine gun and artillery fire. Young men who had never heard a shot, fired in anger, were suddenly thrust into one of the most violent battlefields in American history. Many never made it beyond the surf. Many more pressed forward despite seeing their friends fall beside them. Their determination and courage under fire remains among the most inspiring examples of military heroism ever recorded. General Eisenhower spoke of that gravity in the letter that I read to you. Now, 40 years later, on June 6, 1984, it was President Ronald Reagan who stood atop the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc in Normandy and delivered one of the most moving speeches ever given by an American president. Speaking before the surviving Rangers who had scaled those cliffs under enemy fire, Reagan reminded the world of what had happened there. "These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc," he said. "These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. These are the heroes who helped end a war," he said solemnly to the crowd before listening through their muffled tears. President Reagan understood that the story of D-Day was not merely about military strategy or battlefield tactics. It was about character, sacrifice, and duty. Looking at the aging veterans before him, he declared, 40 summers have passed since the battle that you fought here. You were young that day you took the cliffs. Some of you were hardly more than boys, with the deepest joys of life before you. Yet you risked everything here." That speech remains one of the finest tributes ever paid to the men who fought in Normandy. I would be remiss if I did not take the time to urge you to listen to the speech in its entirety. Today, visitors to Normandy can see the price that was paid for victory. The American cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer overlooks Omaha Beach. More than 9,300 American servicemen rest there beneath rows of white marble crosses and stars of David. The grounds are immaculate. The silence is profound. Every grave represents a life cut short in the service of freedom. Across Europe, American cemeteries stand as enduring reminders of sacrifice. From France to Belgium, from Luxembourg to the Netherlands, thousands of Americans remain buried far from home. They lie in honored glory beneath the soil of the continent. They helped liberate. The cemeteries are sacred ground, not only for Americans, but for all who cherish liberty. The story of D-Day has been preserved through countless books and personal accounts. It is perhaps very celebrated in films, books, personal accounts, again, as I say. Among the most important is The Longest Day by Cornelius Ryan, published in 1959 and later became a major motion picture. The book revolutionized the way military history was written. Ryan sought to tell the story through the eyes of those who had been there, those who had actually lived it. To gather those memories, he placed advertisements in newspapers and reached out to veterans, asking them to share their experiences. The response turned out to be extraordinary. Hundreds of soldiers, sailors, airmen, resistant fighters, and civilians sent letters describing what they had seen and endured on June 6th of 1944. Ryan, in that book, meticulously assembled from those first-hand accounts a narrative that remains one of the most definitive works on D-Day. His book preserves voices that might otherwise have been lost forever. Military planners used the term D-Day simply to designate the day an operation would begin. Likewise, D+ referred to the number of days after the event. D+1 meant 1 day after D-Day. Therefore, D+3 meant 3 days after D-Day. By that measure, June 6, 2026, that would be yesterday, marks approximately D-Day plus 29,950. Less than 30,000 days have passed since American forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. In the span of world history, 30,000 days is not a long time. The veterans who fought there are not ancient figures from a distant past. The veterans who fought there are ancient figures that we must celebrate. They are men whose lives still overlap with our own. Many of us knew them as fathers, grandfathers, uncles, neighbors, teachers, or friends. Their memories are still within reach. Their example remains relevant. Their sacrifice continues to shape the world we inhabit. As we commemorate the 82nd anniversary of D-Day, Americans should pause to reflect upon what those young men accomplished. They faced impossible odds. They crossed a hostile sea. They climbed cliffs, breached fortifications, and fought through machine gun fire because they believed that tyranny must be defeated and freedom must prevail. The Allied forces did more than win a battle. They liberated nations. They restored hope to millions. They helped destroy one of the most evil regimes in human history. Their victory literally changed the course of civilization. The men of D-Day asked for little in return. Most returned home and resumed ordinary lives. They built businesses, raised families, attended church, coached Little League teams, helped build the strongest and most prosperous nation the world has ever known. Their legacy is not readily found in monuments, museums, or cemeteries. It lives in every generation that enjoys the freedoms they preserved. As President Ronald Reagan reminded us that day on the beaches of Normandy, we will always remember, we will always be proud, we will always be prepared, and so may we always be free. So on this anniversary of D-Day, celebrated yesterday, those words remain as true and as necessary as ever. Thanks for joining us today in the Stone Zone. I'm Roger Stone in The Roger Stone Show, and we'll be right back.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
The biggest stage in world soccer is days away, and every goal changes everything. And now FanDuel's giving you a reason to root for every single one. Introducing Every Goal Pays. Bet on a match and get bonus bets for every goal scored in that match. Oh, that's right. More goals means more bonus bets, and all you have to do is turn on your token. Visit FanDuel.com and get started now. Let there be goals on FanDuel.
21 plus select states for Kansas in affiliation with Kansas Star Casino. 18 plus DCKYWY. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. 1-800-MY-RESET. 888-789-7777. Visit ccpg.org/chat. Connecticut. Visit mdgamblinghelp.org. Maryland. Visit gamblinghelplinema.org. Call 800-327-5050. Massachusetts. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY. Text HOPE-NY in New York. Call 877-770-7867. Louisiana.
Visit FanDuel.com. Get started now. Let there be goals this summer on FanDuel.
The Roger Stone Show.
Entertaining and informative.
On the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome back into the Stone Zone here on the Roger Stone Show. In just a little bit, joining me will be Eric Metaxas, author, man of God, one of the best dressed men in the planet, to talk about his new book, Revolution. I want to talk a little bit about some of his other books as well, but yesterday it was 10 years ago that my mother, Gloria Rose Corbo Stone, passed and left this mortal coil. It was from my mother that I inherited my grit, my toughness, my resilience, and yes, my faith. And yes, I wandered from the church, but I returned to it. And therefore, it's about my mother that I think whenever I begin cooking Sunday dinner. And as I have said many times on this show, when I'm making the Sunday gravy, the only acceptable tomatoes for my mother, and therefore for me, and therefore you, are San Marzano tomatoes. Not because it sounds exotic, not because it sounds fashionable, not because some celebrity chef whispered into a camera lens. I use San Marzano tomatoes because of culinary truth, kind of like political truth. It exists whether it's fashionable opinion acknowledges it or not. Now, San Marzano is not a brand. It's not a marketing slogan. It's not a contrivance birthed in some boardroom. San Marzano is a place. It's a tangible, ancient, agrarian reality. It's a small town in the Campania region of southern Italy, situated in a fertile volcanic plain near Mount Vesuvius, where for centuries this land has been saturated with mineral-rich ash and trace elements deposited by the surrounding volcanoes. Therefore, the soil is dark, loamy, and fecund, possessing chemical composition uniquely suited to the cultivation of these extraordinary plum tomatoes. The result is not accidental. It is the product of tradition, a stubborn fidelity to ancestral farming methods, and the uniqueness of the location. San Marzano tomatoes are sold by many brands. You can find them at Christini's or D'Agostino's or any fine grocery store, but make sure when you look at the label you look carefully so that it doesn't say San Marzano style tomatoes, because that's a fugazi. San Marzano tomatoes are elongated and they're plum-shaped. Their flesh is dense and unctuous. Their seed cavities are sparse. The skins are thin and compliant. Their flavor profile is exquisite. It's a rich equilibrium of sweetness, acidity, nothing shrill, nothing cloying, nothing coarse, only depth, resonance, and composure. The tomato used for proper sauce is a plum tomato, not a slicing tomato, not a beefsteak tomato, not a watery salad variety bred for superficial beauty rather than substance. Plum tomatoes are cultivated for concentration, structure, and gravitas. Among plum tomatoes, San Marzano occupies an almost sacerdotal status. While San Marzano tomatoes are gently coaxed in olive oil and garlic, oil, basil, and perhaps a faint tremor of red pepper, they undergo an alchemical transformation when I make sauce. They do not dissolve into thin soup. They evolve into sauce, or gravy if you prefer. Silken, luminous, redolent, a substance that clings to pasta with aristocratic dignity. This is the sauce of my mother. This is the sauce of my grandmother. This is the sauce of my great-grandmother. Now, we must address the legion of imposters. Right now, there is a lawsuit against one particular tomato company for selling San Marzano-style tomatoes. So don't be fooled. When you go to the grocery store and you're getting ready to make the perfect sauce, whether it is just a marinara sauce or it is Sunday gravy, as we call it, 1/3 beef, 1/3 pork, 1/3 veal, look for the real thing. Genuine San Marzano tomatoes are protected under a European designation called Denominazione di Origine Protetta, meaning protected designation of origin. Find the real thing, San Marzano tomatoes. Nothing else will suffice. I dedicate this segment to my late mother. God bless you. We'll be right back with Eric Metaxa on the other side.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show.
Entertaining and informative.
On the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome back to the Stone Zone right here on the Roger Stone Show. Joining me now is Eric Metaxas. Eric is an author, a thinker, a Christian, and, he's appeared numerous times on my yearly international best dressed list. He's an extraordinary author. I think my favorite book of his is Bonhoeffer, which is considered by many to be a masterpiece, one of the most compelling biographies of moral courage written in recent decades, but he's written a number of great books: Amazing Grace, Is Atheism Dead?, one of my favorites, Letter to the American Church, and now he has written a new book called Revolution. He was born in New York City in Astoria, but grew up near where I grew up. He grew up in Danbury, Connecticut. I grew up in Norwalk, Connecticut. He is one of the few people who can curb my Sicilian temper, and when he calls me and tells me that I need to tone it down, well, he's somebody I listen to. Eric, welcome to the Roger Stone Show.
Roger, just an honor just to be with you and a joy to hear your voice. You make me suddenly self-conscious of what I'm wearing, even though this is radio. That's the influence you've had on me.
Well, fortunately, I have a face for radio. I want to talk about your new book, Revolution, The Birth of the Greatest Nation in the History of the World, which is available now. I have ordered the book. First and foremost, I've read all of your books on my ad. Some of them you sent me for free. Some I actually paid for. But let's start from the beginning. Why did you write this book?
Well, it's not complicated. If you're a patriot, you understand this. We've been living in our lifetimes with American history has been denigrated. It has been pushed to the side. If you put a microphone in somebody's face in 1960 in mainstream America, said, you know the story of America, you know these names, everybody knew this stuff. Something happened, in the last, let's say, 60 or 70 years that it's kind of floated out of our culture. There's tremendous ignorance, and the ignorance about our story, about the founding, about the American Revolution, one of the greatest events in the history of the world, it leads to lack of freedom. And, a couple of years ago, we almost lost the country, and we're still in a battle. I don't need to tell you. So it is vital that we know our story. And a friend of mine read my book, Seven Men. He read my chapter on George Washington a couple of years ago, and he said, Eric, you got to write the whole story of the revolution. Have you ever thought of that? And I said, are you crazy? The whole revolution? But then I thought to myself, there is not a book out there that I could recommend and say, hey, here's the story. When a book like that doesn't exist, I think maybe I should write it. And as you know, I've written about history, and I think I always want my writing to be very readable. It's not enough the book exists. Are people going to want to read the book? Are they excited to read the book? And so I thought about it, and I thought, you know what? I think I need to do this for the 250th. And it's a huge project. And people kept asking when I said I'm writing a book on the revolution, what's your angle? I said, I have no angle. I just want to tell the story. We need to know our story. We all need to know these names, and we need to know the details of Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill and everything. Every American needs to know this. This is not for history buffs. This is for Americans. If you're an American, you need to know this. A lot of us heard it in school. Maybe we forgot it. I said, I want to put it all together in one book. That's my goal. So they said, what's your angle? I said, I have no angle but to tell the story. But in the course of doing the research, and I just read a ton of books, an angle kept emerging. It kept hitting me that we haven't heard the true story. The true story is really that God was at the center of the American Revolution in a way that I had never heard before. And this is, you don't need to be a Christian to believe this. This is American history I'm talking about. But all of these guys were coming from the point of view that we want to honor God and how we live. And as the British, start to kind of push us and ask us or demand that we pay taxes, whatever, all these Americans, in a sense, they found their voice and they said, no, we have principles. We believe our rights come from God. And King George III in the Parliament thought, shut up and pay the money. It really is a fascinating contrast. And so it made me more patriotic, and it made me more zealous to tell the story, because we've heard all kinds of versions. I mean, the versions that we hear about the founding is always that, they were all deists and it all comes out of the French Enlightenment. That is total garbage. I mean, I have to tell you, having done the research now, I am shocked that how the leftist academy has pushed this on us and pushed it on us through PBS. And that, so the most people kind of think, Washington was a deist. Complete nonsense. These were fire-breathing evangelical Christians by today's standards, and everything they did and were willing to die for came out of their Christian faith. And that's just part of the story, but we need to know this story. This is our story, and you're not going to hear it on PBS.
Eric, we have to take a quick break here, and we'll be right back with you.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
And we're back on the Roger Stone Show. We were talking to my good friend Eric Metaxas, who's written a terrific new book, Revolution, The Birth of the Greatest Nation in the History of the World. I urge you to order it immediately. All of Eric's books are terrific. But Eric, you were beginning to tell us about the central role that God played, and you described the revolution in your book as a sacred cause. Please explain.
Well, before I do that, I just heard the president's voice, introducing you, and I'm laughing because 2 nights ago, our president, endorsed this book very aggressively. And I thought, what a joy that we have a president that actually cares about our history in this way. He's not giving us the woke version. He actually cares about the true patriotic nature of our history. It's beautiful. So I said, I got to say that because it makes me very proud, as you can imagine. And also, I got to tell you, if your audience needs any incentive to get my book quickly, the other two books that came out the same day as mine, which I'm competing with on the bestseller list, are a book by somebody named Jill Biden. Perhaps you've heard of her.
Yes.
And another book by somebody named Mike Pence. So I'm competing with them. My book, Revolution, The Birth of the Greatest Nation in the History of the World, is competing with them. So I shamelessly beg your audience, if you're going to buy the book, buy it this week, because this is the opening week. This is when it makes the list. And listen, I think it's important, not because I wrote it, but this version needs to get out, and it needs to break into the mainstream in America. There's so many Americans, they're hungry to know, like, what's the true story. And the New York Times is telling them this insane version, and the left is telling this insane version. And so this gets back to the idea that the reason I titled the book Revolution is I said, even calling it American Revolution is redundant. There has never been a revolution that succeeded except for our revolution. It's the only revolution that actually did what it set out to do. The French Revolution is a joke. They set out to get rid of the king, and they ended up in having a bloodbath and in getting a dictator who names himself the Emperor, Napoleon. The Bolshevik Revolution is a satanic parody of a revolution. It says the people are going to govern, and the people are thrown in the gulag and tortured and persecuted for 70 years. Everywhere you look, people use the term revolution, but the only successful revolution is our revolution, and that is because the men behind our revolution understood we are going to get rid of the king. We're going to declare independence from King George III, and we're going to declare dependence on God. You're not going to hear that very much in history classes or in history books, but that is a fact. I've done the research, and they all understood that we can only govern ourselves if we voluntarily look to God for guidance, and if we take that seriously. And all the founders wrote about this. I mean, the famous quote is from John Adams, where he says that, our Constitution is useless unless you have a population that is moral and religious. You have to have people that take this seriously on their own. And all of these founders wrote about this. They said this is going to come from belief in God, but we can't compel belief in God because we believe in liberty. So it has to come from the people. But every one of the founders understood this. And so in the French Revolution, what do? They get rid of the king. And as I said, it turns to a bloodbath, but they don't stop after they kill the king. They then start killing the priests and the nuns. They wanted to get rid of the church. They wanted to get rid of God. And that secularism, which you see in, you see it obviously in the Bolshevik Revolution and the Chinese Communist Revolution, all these Marxist communists want to push God out. And when you push God out completely, when you reject God, you get something far worse than what you had under the Tsar or under the king. Our revolution is the only successful revolution in the history of the world. We Americans should be bursting with pride that we actually did it. And in fact, one of the heroes, there's so many of these heroes, Samuel Adams, he gives a speech on the steps of Independence Hall the day before they signed the Declaration. So it would have been August 1st, actually, of 1776. He gives a speech, and he says, we have this day restored the sovereign, capital S. In other words, we got rid of one king. We cleared independence from that king, but we cleared dependence on God voluntarily. And that's the only way we can govern ourselves. And it worked. It worked. 250 years later, by the grace of God, we are still governing ourselves. So it's kind of amazing. And it's funny, Roger, because the other thing I didn't notice until I did all the research, and you don't really hear about it, the British were really wicked. The Americans were just dramatically Christian and virtuous, and they talked about virtue, and George Washington is at the top of that list. And they wanted to fight the war in a way that would honor God. It wasn't just about winning. It was about what we're doing is a sacred cause, and we want to honor God, and God will bless us if we honor God. The British were dramatically the opposite. There was a level of immorality. The culture of the British elites was not Christian, but they were sneering at the Christian faith of the Americans. They just thought, what a bunch of, Bible-faced hypocrites. And it's interesting because it reminds me, it's kind of like if the Hollywood elites were to go to war with a group of conservative Texans. That's kind of what you're talking about. It was these elites that just sneered at the values of the people they were fighting with in the 13 colonies. And I've never seen this so clearly until I did all the research, and I thought, it's everywhere I look. Americans need to know this, that the British really were the bad guys. They didn't believe in any of this stuff of your rights come from God, and they mocked it. They thought, we got the power. And it's kind of like, today's deep state. When you're dealing with people, they have no values except power. That's basically what was going on. But the thing is, the Americans actually believed that God was with them, and when they fought the war, they didn't fight the way the British did. I mean, the British were so cruel that Americans would surrender, and the British would bayonet them to death. I mean, it's a level of war crimes and evil that I never really understood. So the British were largely very, very wicked in the way that they fought, and they had a very tremendous corruption and cynicism in their attitude. And they just thought, well, listen, we got the power, we're going to crush you. And the Americans really and truly believed that God was with them, and that if they kept their eyes on him, they would prevail. And I thought, I've never heard this before. I've never heard it, again, you're not going to hear it on PBS, but it became so clear to me. So it's not like my book is about that. My book is just a gallop through all of the history, but it's there. It's unavoidable. And frankly, Americans need to know it. And, that's another reason I wrote the book, as I said, we're at a time in our history as Americans, we need to know this. This is not just for people who kind of like history. Americans, we have to know our story. We have to know these names. When I think of the people who suffered and died for our liberties, we owe it to them to know their story, to teach our kids their story, to celebrate that story. And, since I just didn't see a book that had done that, I said, I've got to write that book. And I'm thrilled that it's selling well. People are excited about it. It's getting great reviews, but I just, I don't expect the New York Times to give it a good review, but I don't care. So we'll leave it at that.
I can confidently predict right now that your book will outsell Jill Biden's book. You can find your book, by the way, in the fiction section of your favorite bookstore. Let me ask you this, Eric. Were there prominent figures who changed in your estimation while writing this book?
Yeah, number one is John Adams. Other than George Washington, there is nobody to compare it with John Adams. He should be 1,000 times more famous than Thomas Jefferson. I mean, I never really understood how important he was. He should be the first name we think of after George Washington. I mean, he was a giant in what he did. He's the man that brought about independence. People don't really, there's a big chapter in my book where I explain this, that he was the guy that made it happen. And sometimes people act like, because Jefferson wrote the first draft of the Declaration, they act like he invented the ideas in the Declaration of Independence. There was not an original idea in the whole document. All this stuff was known by everybody, and they just asked him to put it down in a way that would in fact, it was John Adams who picked Jefferson to write it, because he said he writes with a particular felicity of language. And so sometimes people forget that it was John Adams who oversaw the whole thing. And I have such respect for him. He was a profound Christian. It's kind of amazing. And he and George Washington over and over again state this idea that if we honor God in how we fight, he will give us the victory. We have to honor God in how we live and how we fight. We're not going to do what the British are going to do. We're not going to hire mercenaries like the Hessians and the Native Americans who terrorize civilians and really just gruesome war crimes on the side of the British. The Americans were very strictly enjoined never to stoop to this, that we're going to do it God's way. We're not like that. And, as it happens, the Americans won. So it's sort of it's an amazing story that most of it, I'm perfectly honest when I say I didn't really know it. I mean, I'd heard it in school, a lot of it, but I'd forgotten it. It's time for us, with July 4th coming up, 250th, every American needs to know our story. And if every American knows the true version of this, it changes the country. It's like you walk differently when you know what a privilege it is to live in the United States of America, and the men that suffered and in many cases died so that we could have the liberties that we're tempted to take for granted. We should not take them for granted. There's so many heroes in here. I haven't even mentioned any of them, but I mean, whether it's Nathan Hale, Dr. Joseph Warren, Henry Knox, on and on. Incredible heroes, most of them very strong Christians who lived out their faith, and we simply need to deal with that. You know, you don't need to agree with it or be a Christian, but this is our history, and we need to understand that that's where you get liberties from. They don't come from, you know, French Enlightenment principles, in case anybody's curious.
Interestingly enough, it was also President John Adams who said that if America fell, it would fall from forces in the inside rather than being defeated from forces on the outside. I believe
Yes.
Lincoln also says something
Lincoln said the same
very
thing.
similar.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
I think, unfortunately, that they are both right.
Of course.
So this is the most important time. We hit the 250th anniversary of the country. You have written what some will someday say may be the definitive book on the American Revolution. Where's the best place for people to go get your book, which has a very simple name, Revolution?
Yes, Revolution, the birth of the greatest nation in the history of the world. The easiest place to get it is Amazon, but everybody can go to my website, which is just my name, ericmetaxas.com, which will link you to everything and to all kinds of other stuff that I'm doing, ericmetaxas.com. But I really am, you know, I'm being shameless and asking people, if you think you're going to buy it, please buy it in the next day or so, because that's the first week of the launch. And the first week makes every bit of difference. I mean, if we want to get these ideas into the mainstream, you know, whether into airport bookstores or whatever, because the left, as we know, they don't want this stuff, and they're very aggressive. Even if my book sold the most, whether the New York Times would actually acknowledge it is another story. So I'm very grateful, you know, that I get to put this out there. But we have to do what we can, and this is opening week. So thank you for having me on.
All right, one more time. The book, Revolution, The Birth of the Greatest Nation in the History of the World. You can go to ericmetaxas.com or go to Amazon. But yes, order your copy today. I've written a New York Times best-selling book. It's tough to get on the list when your politics are not their politics. Buy your copy today. Eric, thank you so much for joining us today on The Roger Stone Show.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show.
Entertaining and informative.
On the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome back to The Roger Stone Show. Now we're going to do a little segment we call the Political Roundtable. And joining me for this will be Troy Smith, the editor and publisher of Slingshot.news. You almost don't know where to start. There's so much going on in the political world, but here's a good place to start. Once again, just as Leslie Stahl at 60 Minutes told President Donald Trump to his face that there was never any evidence of Obama's administration spying on the Trump campaign, which, of course, thanks to the declassified documents put forward by the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, we know absolutely definitively did happen. Now we have Kristen Welker of NBC insisting to President Trump that there's not an iota of evidence of fraud in the 2020 election. Troy, what do you make of all of this?
Well, Roger, I, like many Americans, was proud to see the president stand up for the millions of Americans who had their voice ripped away from them in the 2020 election. Let's get down to the brass tacks here. This was a stolen election in which the people's voice was taken from them, and a puppet president was installed that wreaked havoc not only on the United States but on the world, and put our country in a position where we essentially were moving backwards for 4 years economically, politically. Everything that we saw in the Biden years was a result of this stolen election. And so many millions of Americans went to the ballot box that day to vote for President Donald Trump because they wanted a change. They wanted to see a continuation of the policies under President Trump. So when Kristen Welker started throwing these accusations at the president that he was lying about the 2020 election. He was very clear on this. His quotes, I want to read them here so people get an idea of how the president stood up for us and stood up for the American people. He said the election was rigged, talking of 2020. It was a dirty election, and it's happening again right now in California. He said, referring to the mayoral and gubernatorial elections going on in that state right now. He said they're cheating on the elections. And then Welker comes back and pressed for evidence. And he says, look, all I have to do is look, and I listen to people, and let's see what happens. Do you think it's appropriate that they have an election, and 5 days later, they're nowhere close to picking a winner? They're crooked, just like you're crooked. Your press is crooked, and Meet the Press is crooked. And then eventually, Roger, he walks off of the interview. He says, I've had enough. Thank you for your time. He's very polite about it. He does not, it's not an insulting thing. It's more of a, I'm standing up for the people. So I'd like to get your thoughts on, that California election, what his statement is on that, and then just your thoughts on going forward. Are we going to get the truth about the 2020 election?
Well, first of all, the assertion that there's no evidence of fraud is, of course, a joke. The sworn testimony of the Fulton County Board of Elections officials before the state Senate under oath, 35,000 ballots with no matching signatures and no matching serial numbers were counted. Trump supposedly lost Georgia by 8,000 votes. There's proof right there, Kristen. Or 300,000 ballots showing up at Michigan at 3 o'clock in the morning that are supposedly mail-in ballots, but they've never been folded in half. Consequently, it means that they were never mailed. How's that for proof? Just that mathematical statistics don't make any sense. Trying to tell me that Joe Biden got 81 million votes, more votes for president than any candidate in American history, and that he ran an average of 20% better in African-American precincts in the urban centers of America than Barack Obama. Zero chance. I wish I had more time to prepare for the show, but by next week, I will have a list of all of the evidence. My good friend, by the way, Joe Hoft, has written a 3-volume book containing all the evidence that the 2020 election. But I think we're going to find out, because one of the charges that President Trump gave Tulsi Gabbard before she left office was to get to the bottom of what really happened in the 2020 election. And this pertains to both paper ballots, mail-in ballots, but also into the integrity and the security of electronic voting machines. But here's one thing you can say about the corporate media left. Once they get stuck on a narrative, like January 6th was an insurrection, or there was never any spying on Donald Trump's campaign, or the 2020 election was a clean and honest election. They will never, ever deviate, despite all of the evidence to the contrary. And you speak of California. This fellow Spencer Pratt's running a very interesting campaign. Seems kind of like a guy who came out of nowhere. The mayor, Karen Bass, an unabashed public fan of Mao Zedong and Fidel Castro, who she lists as her two greatest heroes. As you recall, they had some fires there. I think those fires are suspicious. There's been no building process. I think somebody wanted that real estate. And it appeared that Spencer Pratt had come out of nowhere in order to make the finals, because if no candidate gets 50% in the first round, they go to a second round until the two top voting getters face off. Then suddenly, a city council member who all night has been running third, suddenly there's a late drop of ballots, and they're 90% for her. How incredible. How coincidental. Now it appears that he will narrowly miss the runoff. It certainly smells extremely fishy to me.
Well, and especially, Roger, it seems that as we go on, technology improves in almost every aspect of our lives. The phones get better. The televisions get better. The only thing that seems to get worse are the voting machines. And you have to look at that and say, oh, okay, this is a little intentional now. Come on. And, when we examine, like you just talked about, the statistical facts about the 2020 election, there's no doubt that the questionable activity far outnumbers the margins by which Joe Biden won the most important states. And Roger, when we look at 2024 and the election outcome where President Trump wins literally every swing state, we have to examine that and say, look, the numbers here just don't add up. And I think it's important, not just for President Trump, but for the country, that we get the truth on that, not only because it's important for our history, it's also to prevent it from happening again. And when we look at California and so many other elections, Roger, I don't think people have the confidence they once did, and 2020 is a huge part of that. We talked briefly there about the underhanded nature of the media, Roger, and how Trump was calling out the media. I also wanted to get your opinion on this latest story about the Southern Poverty Law Center. They've been caught funneling $4.1 million to extremist groups across the far right, the extremist groups they claim support President Trump. It turns out the SPLC has been funneling them millions and millions of dollars. They have reportedly maintained a covert network of paid informants embedded within extremist organizations for decades. The use of confidential sources is itself not unlawful, but law enforcement agencies, journalists, and intelligence services have relied upon informants throughout history. And the government's case is not based upon the mere existence of informants. Rather, prosecutors focus on how those informants are allegedly funded. So, Roger, they basically take millions of dollars, pump it into groups that have no activity or little activity. Those groups then go out and commit acts of violence or horrible protests like in Charlottesville where people lose their lives. And then the political right is blamed. I wanted to get your thoughts on this bombshell story about the SPLC.
Yeah, I'm going to be talking about this a little bit later in the show. It really appears to me right now, based on this new superseding indictment, that the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a major fundraising scam, funneled over $1 million into groups that were directly tied into the infamous 2017 Charlottesville rally. So to put it another way, there wasn't enough right-wing extremism in the country for them to be able to raise money to fight, so they went out and paid to create it. An FBI agent a long time ago told me if you went to a Ku Klux Klan rally, the problem was there'd be 10 people there, 9 of them would be federal informants, and 1 would be an actual Klansman. I think that pretty much sums it up. Let's move on. What else you got for us today, Troy?
Well, Roger, there's a big lawsuit going on right now. It's breaking headlines, and it has to do with the UFC fight that's going to be hosted on the White House lawn. There was a filing made Saturday by a leftist group called the Public Integrity Project on behalf of 2 Virginia residents that contend that the Trump administration's authorization of the June 14th UFC event on the White House lawn was unlawful. The lawsuit says that such approval violated the National Park Service regulations prohibiting sporting events on federal parklands. I did a little research on this, Roger, and it turns out that since the National Park Service falls under the executive branch, that President Trump appears to have full legal authority to have this UFC event on the White House lawn. It appears that this lawsuit is really a leftist attack in order to get him to, it's basically just trying to make him look bad. I wanted to get your thoughts on this and many other lawsuits out there. We just saw a lawsuit where the Kennedy Center, Trump's renovations on that have been shut down. It appears that there's an effort by the judiciary at whatever cost to the people to stop President Trump from improving life for people in Washington, D.C. and doing things for the country.
You mentioned the Kennedy Center. This one is even more outrageous. So the Kennedy Center has needed renovations for so many decades. It is now physically dangerous. It is literally in danger of collapsing. It is in danger of being a public safety hazard. A federal judge overstepped their authority to order that it cannot even be closed down for renovations, and that the president doesn't have the authority to change the board, doesn't have the authority to change the name. So they would rather see it collapse into a pile of dust and maybe kill somebody than see the president get credit for restoring it into what it should be. a worldwide recognized exhibition center for the arts. The president, I think, has decided to just walk away. So he has essentially handed the entire hot potato over to Congress. And I suspect it'll only be a matter of time before the building collapses, or they do what they've did in the past, overspend tremendously for improvements that either never get made or where the workmanship is shoddy. Now, I don't have tickets to the UFC event. Wouldn't mind having them. I'm a UFC fan. Kobe Covington, one of my good friends. Others there among the UFC roster. But again, if the president is for someone, somebody on the left is against us. Our biggest problem here are these tyrannical federal judges who are legislating from the bench, who are, I think, overturning the will of the American people in the last election. They don't even really care what the Congress thinks. It is the number one problem in the country. It's interesting that the president of El Salvador points out that corrupt judges were for a long time the bane of their society. They had a lawless society, one of the most dangerous countries in Central America. Today, one of the safest places and a prosperous economy and a safe place to live yet again. Jill Biden's book, which came up in our last interview, pretty extraordinary. I guess we have to go to a break. We'll be right back with a little bit more of our political roundtable with my good friend Troy Smith from Slingshot.News. But I want to come back and talk about Jill Biden's book. I understand you can find it in the fiction section of your local bookstore. We'll be right back.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show.
Entertaining and informative.
On the Red Apple Podcast Network.
And we're back on the Roger Stone Show. You know, I was going to talk about Jill Biden's book, but there's something more important I want to cover with my guest, Troy Smith, and that is the appointment by President Donald Trump of William J. Bill Pulte to be the acting director of national intelligence. The deep state is in absolute apoplexy over this. Oh my God, we have someone we can't control. Someone smart, tough, and fiercely loyal to the President of the United States. They are literally going out of their mind. He has no intelligence experience, they yell. Really? What was Allen Dulles before he was the head of the CIA? He was a lawyer. How does that qualify him to be an intelligence official? This is an absurdity. The president has chosen someone he trusts. The Office of National Intelligence is meant to be a check, oversees the FBI, the CIA, as well as naval and army intelligence. And they don't want oversight. If it were not for Tulsi Gabbard and the Office of ODNI, we would not know the truth about the Russian collusion hoax. We would not know the truth about the phony impeachment. We would not know that there were still 37 Biden-Obama officials, many of whom signed that famous letter of 51 claiming falsely that Hunter Biden's laptop was Russian disinformation. I think it's vitally important the president have someone he can trust in this position, and they have gone into high gear in their opposition.
Well, Roger, you're exactly right, and it's not just Pulte, as well as Gabbard, who did a fantastic job. Tulsi Gabbard, who did an amazing job in this position. She has been attacked by the media time and time again as well. So we see that in this crucial position, Roger, anybody who has loyalty to the president comes under intense scrutiny. We have to ask ourselves why. And the answer is pretty clear. It's that the people who are doing things behind the guise of classification, whether it be surrounding the JFK assassination or what happened in Butler, Pennsylvania, or anything of that nature, the people who are involved in covering up that kind of information, their biggest fear is that somebody with a patriotic sense, with a will to accomplish things, not some government bureaucrat. Somebody with the will to accomplish things would be placed into that position and shed light on their misdeeds. Because in order for their corruption to continue, Roger, they can't have a spotlight on the past. They can't have a spotlight on things that they've done in the past that have really hurt this country tremendously.
I think that sums it up. I want to thank my guest, Troy Smith, for the Political Roundtable here on The Roger Stone Show. Until next week, God bless you and Godspeed.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show.
Entertaining and informative.
On the Red Apple Podcast Network.
I had hoped to wrap it up for today, but now I'm back with a special report. In medieval Europe, wealthy monarchs sometimes paid pirates to attack rival kingdoms while publicly condemning piracy. See, this arrangement allowed rulers to profit from the chaos while maintaining the appearance of moral authority. History is filled with examples of power institutions secretly nurturing the very threats they publicly claim to oppose. According to a newly filed superseding indictment by the United States Department of Justice, federal prosecutors now allege that an organization called the Southern Poverty Law Center may have been operating under a similarly astonishing contradiction for decades. You see, the Southern Poverty Law Center portrayed itself as the nation's foremost opponent of racism, white supremacy, and political extremism through direct mail campaigns, media appearances, fundraising appeals, litigation, and its controversial hate group designations. By the way, I made their lists on many occasions. The organization amassed an enormous financial empire and became one of the most influential and wealthiest political advocacy organizations in America. Its reports were treated as gospel by the corporate media. If the SPLC said you were a bad guy, well, then you must be a bad guy. Its accusations were repeated over and over again by politicians. Technology companies relied upon its designations when deciding who could be heard and who could not. Banks, advertisers, universities, and government agencies often treated its determinations as somehow authoritative. But the Southern Poverty Law Center did not merely influence public opinion, it became one of the principal gatekeepers of acceptable political recourse in America today. Now, federal prosecutors are presenting a dramatically different picture. As many of those who have listened to Stone Zone may remember from my earlier reports, I examined the long-standing criticisms of this organization, including allegation that it exaggerated threats, inflated hate group statistics, and weaponized political labels to generate donations and silence ideological opponents. The newly filed superseding federal indictment moves far beyond my criticisms into the realm of alleged federal criminal conduct. According to federal prosecutors, the Southern Poverty Law Center maintained a covert network of paid informants embedded within extremist organizations, sometimes for decades. The use of confidential sources is not in itself unlawful. Law enforcement agencies, journalists, and intelligence services have relied upon informants throughout history. As Napoleon once said, spies are everything. But the government's case is not based upon the mere existence of informants. Rather, prosecutors focus on those informants were allegedly funded and who those payments were allegedly concealed and what activities those funds allegedly supported. The original indictment, returned in April, charged the Southern Poverty Law Center with 6 counts of wire fraud, 4 counts of making false statements to a federally insured financial institution, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit concealment of money laundering. But the superseding indictment reportedly expands the factual allegations while retaining the original charges. Federal prosecutors now allege that approximately $4.1 million in tax-exempt dollar funds were funneled through fictitious entities, shell accounts, prepaid cards, and other concealed financial mechanisms. According to this new federal indictment, these funds ultimately reached individuals who were leaders, members, or affiliates of organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan, the Aryan Nation, the National Socialist Movement and other repugnant extremist groups. The allegations don't stop there. Prosecutors now contend that some of the money was allegedly used not merely to gather intelligence, but to sustain the operations of the very organizations that the SPLC publicly denounced. The superseding indictment, supervised by the new Attorney General, acting Attorney General now, but just appointed Attorney General, Todd Blanche, reportedly includes additional details regarding funds allegedly used for recruiting efforts, transportation, organizational activities, rallies, and the purchase of materials associated with extremist events. In those allegations, if those allegations are ultimately proven in court, the implications would be staggering. Imagine a fire department secretly providing fuel to arsonists while simultaneously raising money to fight fires. That's what we're talking about here. Imagine a temperance organization financing bootleggers while collecting donations to combat alcoholism. That is the contradiction that federal prosecutors appear to be alleging in this very case. The government's central argument is straightforward. Donors contributed money believing that they were supporting efforts to dismantle extremist organizations. Prosecutors allege that significant amounts of those funds were instead secretly directed to individuals operating within those organizations, while the true nature of the transaction was concealed from donors. In other words, among the most striking allegations are claim that one informant associated with a so-called neo-Nazi organization allegedly received more than $1 million over time. Another individual reportedly received hundreds of thousands of dollars while maintaining involvement in activities connected to the infamous 2017 Charlottesville rally. Prosecutors allege that several informants occupied influential positions within extremist organizations while receiving these Southern Poverty Law Center funds. So the Southern Poverty Law Center, of course, has vigorously denied all wrongdoing. The organization has pleaded not guilty and argues that the prosecution represents political retaliation by the Trump organization. The SPLC lawyers maintain that the informant program was a legitimate intelligence gathering operation designed to monitor dangerous organizations, gather information, and share actionable intelligence with law enforcement agencies. They contend that conventional sources help prevent violence and contribute to successful criminal investigations over many years. Well, we'll see in a federal courtroom. The arguments will be evaluated in federal court, where the SPLC remains presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty. Yet, regardless of the eventual verdict, the case exposes a profound irony. For decades, the SPLC built its reputation by casting itself as the moral protector of American public life. It accused others. It labeled others. It investigated others. It judged others. It frequently did so with little regard for the reputational destruction that followed. A court of federal law will decide who's right and who's wrong. I'm Roger Stone, and we'll be right back here in the Stone Zone, right here on The Roger Stone Show.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome back into the Stone Zone. Well, the smear campaign against President Richard Nixon unfortunately continues. The Smithsonian is now falsely claiming that President Richard Nixon was impeached in its new exhibition on the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. The gallery's American Presidents exhibit will be open to the public on May 15th and includes a portrait of the 37th president by acclaimed American artist Norman Rockwell. Jim Byron, president and chief executive officer of the Richard Nixon Foundation, wrote a letter to the gallery's acting director, Elliot Gruber, noting that the biography accompanying the president's portrait falsely states that Richard Nixon was impeached on charges of obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. In fact, President Nixon was never impeached. He resigned on August 9, 1974, before the House of Representatives had voted on articles of impeachment. I will trust you will take immediate steps to correct this mistake, lest many visitors to this handsome new gallery are misled about our 37th president. the Richard Nixon Foundation CAO president added. This latest distortion is not an accident. It is part of the continuing institutional smear campaign against one of our greatest presidents that has continued for more than a half a century long after his death. My question is simple. Will the president who ended the war in Vietnam ever get his due? Will the president who appointed more African Americans to federal office than both Lyndon Johnson and John F. Kennedy combined ever get his due? Will the president who reached a strategic arms limitation agreement with the Soviets after skillfully playing them off against the Chinese by recognizing China at a time that China was a dirt-poor, agrarian, backward society whose military and economy was no danger to ours, will he ever get his due? Will the president who desegregated the public schools without bloodshed or violence, will he ever get his due? Will the president who ended the military draft, will he ever get credit? Will the president who gave us the 18-year-old vote, will that ever be recognized? Will the president who saved Israel from total and complete annihilation in the 1973 war, will he ever get recognized for that act of statesmanship? Will the man who gave us the Environmental Protection Agency ever be recognized for that accomplishment? He is among our greatest presidents, yet they don't want to talk about anything but Watergate. The rehabilitation of Richard Nixon's record is a necessity for all Americans. We must understand the nature of the deep state to note that they had been in charge long before they were forced to reveal themselves in the coordinated effort to destroy President Trump. Declassified documents released within the last 2 years prove without any question whatsoever that the Central Intelligence Agency knew in advance about the efforts to break into the Watergate Hotel. The one person who did not know was one Richard Milhous Nixon. And why would he do so? As a veteran of 6 national Republican tickets, Nixon knew that there was nothing to be learned at the Democrat National Committee. And there has never been any evidence at a time when he was leading in the polls in 49 states. By the way, he carried 49 states out of 50 in the greatest landslide in American history. He knew there was nothing there worth finding. The truth about Watergate makes this clear. Former White House counsel John Dean decided only to become a whistleblower when he realized that all of his own illegal acts would be exposed, because he is the man who planned, pushed, covered up, paid for, and then lied to Richard Nixon for 19 months about the Watergate break-in. The Watergate special prosecutors were partisan Democrat Justice Department lawyers. Recently declassified documents prove, yet again, the CIA was well aware of the planned break-in and infiltrated the burglar team, with at least 4 of the burglars still actively on the CIA payroll. Special counsel Watergate counsel Nick Ackerman, who tries to pose today as some kind of law enforcement official, but is a vicious partisan, insists that Nixon knew about the break-in, that they could just never prove it. That means they have no proof, and it didn't happen. Ackerman did, however, based on declassified documents, know full well about the CIA's involvement, but did nothing about it. He retains the crown as the single biggest piece of, well, you know what, I've met in my 45 years in politics. Bob Woodward, another congenital liar. He was a naval intelligence asset with no prior journalistic experience, suddenly teamed up with Carl Bernstein as primary source. Their primary source was not Mark Felt. It was, as we now know, General Alexander Haig. Great book called Haig's Coup by the USA Today reporter Ray Locker. By the way, Bob Woodward got him fired after writing that book. Newsmax reporter James Rosen has revealed from classified documents that the CIA infiltrated the burglar team with assets still doing the agency's bidding. In an obscure post-presidency interview, Nixon himself said he found it difficult to understand why the CIA, with advanced knowledge and assets aside, never informed him of exactly what was taking place. Nixon noted the agency has ample motive to undermine his presidency because he was dissatisfied with their Soviet assessments and planned to cut a third of their personnel. I was going to shape up the organization, he said. The CIA feared him, and for good reason. This was the deep state work at shaping politics in the shadows, long before it was forced to reveal itself against President Donald Trump. In one of his best quotes, the president said, "The greatness comes when you're really tested, when you take some knocks, when there are some disappointments, when sadness comes. Because only if you've been in the deepest valley can you ever know how magnificent it is to be on the highest mountain." He also said, "A man is not finished when he is defeated. He is only finished when he quits." There are lessons that all Americans must internalize if we're going to harden themselves for the grueling battle that lies ahead to renew this country. Through understanding Nixon's legacy and the truth about him, the truth that the media works today so hard to hide, the truth that the Smithsonian does not want to acknowledge, it can only be reasoned or reformed and crushed and ushered into the ashman of history where these lies belong. I will keep getting off the map because I learned from the best. Every American patriot should also learn the truth of Richard Nixon's presidency and his example as a man who was resilient and determined and who would not accept defeat. Until each one of us can maintain his own iron resolve as he did, well, then our movement will be unstoppable. In the meanwhile, bad news. The House voted narrowly to pass a Democrat-led War Powers resolution last Wednesday aimed at rebuking President Donald Trump's handling of the conflict with Iran. The measure, introduced by Representative Gregory Meeks of New York, passed 215 to 208 with 4 rhinos, those are Republicans in name only, joining Democrats. Those are Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, Thomas Massey of Kentucky, still smarting from his primary loss, Tom Barrett of Michigan, and Warren Davidson of Ohio. The resolution directs President Trump to remove U.S. forces from hostilities with Iran unless Congress formally authorizes military action. How very strange. Why didn't the Congress ever restrain the president who dropped more bombs, used more drones, and killed more people than any other? Barack Hussein Obama. But the measure is largely symbolic and does not immediately end the conflict. Plus, there are extremely few U.S. forces actually involved in the current Iranian operation. The resolution is a desperate political stunt designed to undermine President Trump at a critical moment. The administration is in the midst of pressuring Iran into abandoning its nuclear ambitions, while Democrats and a handful of weak-kneed so-called Republicans are sending Tehran a message of division and weakness. House Foreign Affairs Chairman Brian Mast called the vote total BS, and that I agree with him, arguing that lawmakers could not even identify which forces they supposedly wanted withdrawn. He said the real purpose was political theater that weakens the president's hands during negotiations at a time of an international crisis. Fitzpatrick, Massey, Barrett, and Davidson handed Democrats a messaging victory at a time when America needs unity and strength. Democrats want to tie President Trump's hands abroad, even if it means putting critical national security objectives into jeopardy. Don't expect President Trump to budge as a result of this nature's passage. He will continue being commander-in-chief regardless of the futile whining of a few self-serving Democrats and few misguided Republicans on the fringes of the party. In the meantime, the Congress voted, to my surprise and disdain, another $9 billion package to support Iran in the Ukrainian war. Support Ukraine in the Ukrainian war. Every Democrat, as well as 6 Republicans, voted to advance the Ukrainian Support Act on Wednesday, setting up a vote on another major aid package for Kyiv. The Ukraine measure includes $8 billion in military financing loans, extends the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative through 2027, and authorizes more weapons and sanctions. Democrats are framing the vote as standing with Ukraine against Russian aggression from autocrat Vladimir Putin. They never mention that it is Ukraine that violated 2 different treaties, the Budapest Memorandum and the Minsk Accords, in which we agreed not to push Ukraine into NATO, which is what this war is all about. But there's very little discussion of serious diplomacy, negotiations, or realistic endgame for this bloody conflict. This is Washington, D.C. at work. This is how selective restraint, selective outrage, and support for endless war abroad, as long as that war is rubber-stamped by the global elite, moves forward. America is facing massive deficits, strained military stockpiles, border chaos, and serious problems here at home. Yet Congress still finds billions to send to the corrupt puppet regime of Volodymyr Zelensky. President Trump is elected to put America first, not to let Congress drift back into blank check interventionism. Countless billions have been poured into Ukraine with little to show for it other than thousands of dead soldiers sent to early graves on both sides. This Russia-Ukraine conflict is a proxy war for globalists who hate Russia more than they love peace. It is a time for America to stop the madness, get out of the business of propping up Ukraine, and let Europe bankrupt themselves, funding so if they choose. I'm Roger Stone. Thanks for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed our special report. Until next time, God bless you and Godspeed.
Thanks for listening to The Roger Stone Show. You can hear The Roger Stone Show Sunday afternoons at 3. If you like the podcast, share it with your friends and listen anytime at WABCRadio.com and download the WABC Radio app. Hit that subscribe button on all major podcast platforms. Plus, follow WABC on social on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and X. See you next time for a new episode so you never have to wonder.
What the heck is going on here?
Almonte's Key Food, proudly serving communities throughout Brooklyn, Queens, and Long Island for over 30 years. When you shop Key Food, you'll always find fresh products, great weekly specials, and exceptional personalized service. Visit at any of their Key Food stores at 8235 153rd Avenue, Lindenwood, New York, 935 Rosedale Road, Valley Stream, New York, and 6620 Avenue U, Brooklyn, New York.